All right, ready for this? We're going deep into the Indian Penal Code today. Specifically, a section that deals with, well, some pretty intense stuff. Abetment, criminal conspiracy, and even attempts to commit crimes. It really makes you think about that line between just thinking about something and actually, doing it.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Where does a thought become a crime? How does the law try to figure out what's intent and what's action?
Yeah, exactly. And we're going beyond just the theory. We're going to look at actual real-world examples straight from the code. So let's start with abetment. What does that even mean in Indian law?
Well, Section 45 of the IPC, it defines it pretty broadly. Basically, it covers anything where you're pushing someone to commit a crime, or you're conspiring with them, or even intentionally helping them do it.
Okay, that makes sense. But instigate, that seems a bit vague. What would actually be considered instigation?
Oh, it goes further than you think.
Huh.
The code, it even includes things like, well, willful misrepresentation and even willful concealment.
So even just lying or hiding information could be abetment. Can you give me an example? Like, how would that actually work in real life?
Okay, imagine this. You know someone's wanted by the police. Maybe they have a warrant out. But when the police come asking about them, you point them in the wrong direction. You haven't physically arrested anyone, but you deliberately misled the police.
Yeah.
That could be seen as abetting a wrongful arrest.
Wow. Never thought about it that way. It makes you think about what you say and do, right?
Right.
So what about this term abettor? Is that just a fancy word for someone who helps commit a crime?
Not exactly. Section 46, that's where it gets into the details. It's someone who abets a crime, yes. But, and this is important, they don't have to be the one who actually does it. And the crime doesn't even have to be successful.
Wait, hold on. You mean I could be held responsible for a crime that didn't even happen?
That's what the law says. Let's say you really encourage someone to commit murder, but they chicken out at the last minute. You're still guilty of abetment to commit murder, even though no one was hurt. Or let's say you help someone plan a robbery, but they trip on the way into the bank, the whole thing fails miserably. You're still responsible for abetment, even though it's a total flop.
That's pretty intense. So it's not the outcome that matters most, it's the intention and the steps you took. What if the person goes and does something totally different than what you told them to do? What if I tell someone to steal a car, but then they accidentally hit someone while they're driving away?
That's where it gets even more complicated. Section 50, it basically says you'd be punished based on what would have happened if they had followed the original plan. So like in your car theft example, you'd be responsible for the theft, but hitting the pedestrian. That might be a whole other issue.
So intention really matters here. It's not just the result, it's what the abettor was thinking all along. But what about consequences you didn't intend? Like, what if I encourage someone to do something that seems harmless, but then it leads to something really bad?
The IPC, it has a section just for that. Section 51, it's about probable consequences. It's like a domino effect. You might only push the first domino, but you could be responsible for the whole chain reaction.
Okay, give me an example, something that really shows this probable consequence idea.
Picture this. You tell a kid to, put something in someone's food as a joke, like extra hot sauce, but the kid mixes things up and accidentally puts in poison. Now, you didn't want anyone to get hurt, but telling the kid to mess with the food, that created a situation where something bad could happen.
That's a scary thought. So even if you didn't mean for someone to get poisoned, you could be held responsible because it was a foreseeable consequence.
Yeah, exactly. It really shows how much responsibility you have when you influence someone else, especially when it could put them at risk.
This is heavy stuff. Makes you really think. What about the legal consequences? What kind of punishments are we talking about for abetment?
The IPC, it's very specific about that. It depends on a lot of things. The crime itself, the abettor's intent, the actual outcome. But one thing's clear. The law takes abetment very seriously. Sometimes you could even face the same punishment as the person who actually did it.
Wow. So even if you weren't the one, holding the gun or stealing the money, if you encouraged it or helped, you could be in just as much trouble. That's serious.
Right.
What about if someone, convinces a kid to commit a crime? Does the adult get a worse punishment? Because a child might not, understand the consequences.
That's a very important point. The law, it knows that there's a power difference when an adult influences a kid. In fact, there's explanation 3 under section 46 that addresses this. It says that even if the person, like a child, can't legally commit the crime, the person who told them to do it is still fully responsible.
Makes sense. It's like saying you should have known better. You can't use someone else's vulnerability as an excuse.
Exactly. The law protects those who are vulnerable. And that means holding adults accountable when they take advantage of a child.
This is fascinating, but it brings up more questions. What happens if the crime happens outside India, but the abetment happened here? Does Indian law still apply?
That's where we get into jurisdiction, the reach of the law. Sections 47 and 48, they deal with abetment that crosses borders.
Yeah.
Even if you're in India, but you encourage someone to commit a crime in another country,
Yeah.
you could still be held accountable here.
Wow, I didn't know that. So even if you're far away from the crime, what you do in India matters. Any examples of how this works? Like, what if someone in India tells a friend overseas to do some kind of cybercrime?
That's a great example of how these laws apply in today's world. Cybercrime, it doesn't care about borders. And Indian law enforcement, they've been going after cases where the abetment started in India, even if the actual crime happened on a server somewhere else entirely.
So the internet doesn't erase the law. It almost makes these issues of jurisdiction more complicated, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And it makes me wonder, how do countries work together on these kinds of cases? That's got to be tricky.
You're right. International cooperation is key. It involves a lot of legal hurdles, like extradition treaties and sharing evidence. But it's becoming more and more common because cybercrime is on the rise and criminals are getting smarter.
This is all really insightful. It really shows how connected the world is and how even our online actions can have real consequences that go way beyond where we are physically.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to understand these legal concepts, even if you think they might not apply to you directly. You never know when something you do online could cross the line into abetment, especially as technology keeps blurring the lines between the real world and the digital world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about abetment, and it's clear that it has big implications, both legally and ethically. Now, let's move on to another concept from the IPC. Criminal conspiracy. What does it mean to conspire to commit a crime? And how is that different from abetment?
Great question. This is where we really look at that fine line between thought and action. Section 60, it defines criminal conspiracy as an agreement between two or more people to do something illegal, or to achieve something legal but through illegal means. The key here is agreement.
So if I just think about, robbing a bank with a friend, that's not enough to get me in trouble. There has to be an actual agreement.
Exactly. It's not just brainstorming. There needs to be a clear understanding, a mutual agreement to actually do it. And there's another important part, the code. It says there has to be some action, not just the agreement. You can't just talk about it. Someone has to do something, like buy a getaway car or scope out the bank.
Makes sense. Otherwise, every late-night conversation about crazy ideas would be a criminal conspiracy. But where do you draw that line? What kind of actions are enough to go beyond just talking and into, actually conspiring?
It can be tricky. It depends on the specifics. But generally, the actions have to show a clear intent to commit the crime, and they have to move the plan forward in a real way. For example, just researching how to pick a lock might not be enough. But if you start practicing on locks that are like the ones at the bank you're thinking about robbing, that could be seen as a real step toward committing the crime.
So it's all about showing you're not just dreaming about the crime, but you're actually taking steps to make it happen.
Precisely. And that's where the law says, okay, this is action, not just thought. You can think about committing a crime all you want, but once you start taking steps to do it, that's where you cross the line.
That raises a question. What are the punishments for criminal conspiracy? Are they as bad as the ones for abetment?
It depends on how serious the crime is that you're planning. For big offenses, like murder, the penalties can be just as harsh as if you had actually done it.
So even if the conspiracy doesn't work out and no one gets hurt, you could still face the same consequences. That's tough.
The law sees conspiracies as dangerous, even if they fail. The agreement itself shows a dangerous intention, and the potential for harm is there, even if the plan falls apart.
So it's about stopping those dangerous ideas early on and discouraging people from even making those agreements. What about for less serious crimes? The punishments aren't as bad then, are they?
You're right. For less serious offenses, the punishments are usually less severe, fines or shorter prison sentences. But the consequences can still be big. And remember, even a minor criminal record can have long-term effects.
So it's not something to be taken lightly, even if the crime seems small.
Right. The law doesn't really differentiate between big and small conspiracies when it comes to the principle. An agreement to commit a crime is an agreement to commit a crime, no matter the potential consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about abetment and criminal conspiracy, two pretty complex ideas that get into this whole area of intent versus action. But what about when someone tries to commit a crime, but they don't actually pull it off? Is that still punishable under Indian law?
Ah, that's a great question. And it leads us to our last topic, attempts to commit offenses. Section 61 and 62 of the IPC. They cover this very thing. They outline the punishments for trying to commit a crime, even if you don't succeed.
This seems like a really nuanced area of law. How does the code figure out if someone truly attempted a crime? I mean, where's the line between thinking about doing something illegal and actually trying to do it?
You've hit the nail on the head. The key is whether the person took actions that clearly show they intended to commit the crime, and they went beyond just getting ready. It's not enough to just think about it or even talk about it. They have to have done something that clearly shows they were trying to make it happen.
So, like, daydreaming about robbing a bank wouldn't count. But showing up at the bank with a weapon and a note demanding money, that would.
Exactly. The code uses a really vivid example to explain this. Attempted poisoning. Imagine someone puts poison in a glass, intending for someone else to drink it and die. Even if the person doesn't actually drink it, the act of getting the poison ready and planning for it to be used, that counts as an attempt to commit murder.
Wow, that's a powerful example. It really shows that even if a crime doesn't happen, the intent and the actions taken are still taken very seriously under Indian law. What kinds of punishments are we talking about for attempts?
It depends on how serious the intended crime was. For serious offenses, the penalties can be almost as harsh as if you had actually committed the crime. The law knows that even a failed attempt can be dangerous, and there's often a real possibility of harm, even if it's stopped at the last minute.
So the message is, even taking those first steps towards a crime has serious consequences.
Exactly. The law wants to prevent people from even trying to commit crimes. It wants to make it very clear that even if you fail, you'll still face the consequences.
Welcome back. It's great to, continue exploring these really interesting concepts from the IPC. Last time, we really got into the details of abetment, conspiracy, and attempts. Now let's talk about, why all of this matters.
Exactly. We've got the definitions down. But what about the real world? Why should someone listening, like the average person, care about these laws?
That's the big question, right? It's easy to think this is all just legal stuff that doesn't affect us, but it does. It has a real impact on our lives, even if we never, end up in court.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me an example. How could these laws actually impact someone who's just living their life? Think about the internet, social media. Most of us are online every day. Let's say you see a heated debate online, and someone says something, really bad, something hateful, something that could incite violence. Now, if you just like that comment or even share it, even if you don't write anything yourself, you could be seen as supporting that harmful message.
So even just engaging with bad content online could have legal consequences. I hadn't thought about that.
It's a gray area, definitely, but it's something to keep in mind. The line between free speech and abetting a crime, it can get blurry online. And we have to remember that what we do online can have real-world consequences.
That's a great example. It shows how these laws apply to us in ways we might not even realize. It's not just about avoiding trouble with the law, it's about being responsible online and thinking critically about what we see and share.
Exactly. And it's not just online. Understanding these concepts can help us, recognize dangerous situations in real life and maybe even prevent a crime from happening.
Okay, now you've got me really interested. How could knowing about abetment, for instance, actually help prevent a crime in real life?
Let's say you overhear some people talking. They're planning to, vandalize a park. Now, you're not part of their plan, but you know about it, and you don't do anything to stop it. You could be seen as, complicit.
Hold on. That seems a bit unfair. If I just happen to hear something, do I have to get involved? What if it's dangerous?
That's a good point. It's not always easy. Every situation is different. But knowing the law about abetment can help you make a better decision. You might decide to tell the police anonymously, or maybe you could try to talk to the group, convince them not to do it. The point is, knowing the law gives you choices, and it helps you act responsibly.
So it's not about becoming a hero or anything. It's about being aware of a situation and knowing how to handle it the right way.
Exactly. It's about being part of a safer society. And sometimes that just means knowing when to report something suspicious.
This conversation is really making me think about how connected everything is. What we do, even small things, can have a ripple effect.
That's a great point. It's like the butterfly effect, right? A small change somewhere can have big consequences somewhere else. And the law, in a way, it tries to think about those ripple effects. It holds people accountable for things they do that could hurt others, even if it's not obvious right away.
This is all really eye-opening. I'm seeing how my actions online and offline can impact other people in new ways. We've been talking a lot about individuals, but what about the bigger picture? How do these laws affect society as a whole? How do they shape our ideas about justice and responsibility?
That's the core of it all. These laws, they're not just about punishing people. They're about setting standards for society and upholding a sense of, collective responsibility. They reflect our values and our commitment to fairness and protecting those who are vulnerable.
I'm really interested in how these laws are being used in today's digital world. Every day there are stories about cyberbullying, online scams, data breaches. Are these laws keeping up with technology?
It's a tough challenge. The law is always trying to catch up. But what's really interesting is how these old legal concepts are being applied to these new types of crimes.
Give me an example of how that's working. How are these traditional ideas being used in the digital world?
Think about abetment. Before, it might have been about someone physically helping someone else with a crime. Now it's being used for things like, sharing instructions on how to make a bomb online,
Yeah.
or spreading false information that could lead to violence.
So the idea of abetment is the same, but the way it happens has changed with technology.
Exactly. And we see the same thing with criminal conspiracy. Before, it might have been a group of people meeting in secret to plan something. Now, conspiracies can happen online through secret messaging apps or on the dark web.
It makes you realize that the internet hasn't really changed why people commit crimes. It's just given them new ways to do it.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for the people who make and enforce laws to stay ahead of the game. They need to keep adapting these old legal concepts to deal with the new ways crimes are happening online.
This has been amazing. It's clear that these laws aren't just words on paper. They're tools that show how our ideas about justice and responsibility are changing and how the physical world and the digital world are so intertwined.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing discussion. And every new case, every new technology, it makes us rethink these basic legal ideas and how they apply to how people behave.
Now, as we wrap up this part, I have a question that I think is really important for our listeners to consider. We've talked about how these laws apply to individuals, but what about big companies and governments? Can they be held accountable for abetting or conspiring to commit crimes in the same way that individuals can?
That's a great question, and it's a tough one. It's something that legal experts are debating right now. As corporations get more powerful and as governments use technology in new ways, sometimes controversial ways, it becomes harder to figure out who's responsible.
So it's not just about individuals anymore, it's about holding powerful groups responsible too.
Exactly. And that's a conversation that's just starting. As we move into this more and more complex world, the question of who is responsible for what will become even more important. And these legal concepts will be right at the center of that debate. But that's a deep dive for another time.
I can't wait to continue the conversation. Join us for the final part of our deep dive. We'll be tackling some of these tough questions head on and exploring the future of these legal concepts in a world that's constantly being reshaped by technology. Until then, keep thinking and stay engaged. Welcome back to our deep dive. It's amazing how these ideas of abetment, conspiracy, attempts, they really touch so many parts of our lives, don't they?
It is remarkable. We went from defining these terms to seeing how they affect individuals. And now we're seeing how they fit into the bigger picture of, responsibility in society as a whole.
Right. And last time, we talked about something really important. Corporations and governments, they have so much power. But holding them accountable when something goes wrong, it feels different than, dealing with a single person who breaks the law.
You've hit a really tough question. How do we even apply these ideas of abetment, conspiracy, attempts to these big, powerful groups? It's a question that really challenges legal experts and ethicists.
So walk me through this. Let's say a big company does something that hurts a lot of people. Maybe they put out a product they know is dangerous or pollute the environment. Could they be held accountable under these parts of the IPC we've been talking about?
Yeah, definitely. This idea of corporate criminal liability, it's becoming more common around the world. The idea is that companies, just like people, can be held responsible for their actions, even under criminal law.
So imagine a company's leaders know their product is faulty, but they still sell it to make more money, and people get hurt. Could those leaders be charged with something like, abetment to cause harm?
Absolutely. That's a perfect example of where these legal concepts come in. Prosecutors could say that putting a dangerous product out there, knowing it could hurt people, is like abetment, even if they didn't directly hurt anyone themselves.
That makes sense. But what about proving they intended to do it? It seems harder to prove a whole company intended to commit a crime. They have so many people and processes.
You're right. That's a big challenge in these cases. It often means going through tons of emails, internal documents, meeting notes, trying to find a pattern that shows intent.
It sounds like something out of a movie. What about governments? Can they be held accountable under these laws?
That's where things get really tricky. Governments have some immunity, but it's not absolute. There are times when government officials can be held responsible for crimes they committed while in office, especially if you can prove they acted beyond their authority or abused their power.
So, if a government official knows a project is going to cause environmental damage, but they approve it anyway, or maybe they try to hide a public health crisis, they could be held accountable.
Right. It's about figuring out who's responsible and showing that what the official did or didn't do directly caused the harm.
This is all really thought-provoking. It shows how important transparency and accountability are, not just for individuals, but for big companies and governments too.
Exactly. In a democracy, everyone needs to be accountable, no matter how powerful they are. These legal concepts are really important. They make sure that justice happens and that people who abuse their power are held responsible.
This deep dive has been an amazing journey. We started by just defining these legal terms, and now we're talking about holding corporations and governments accountable. It's incredible how far these ideas go.
It is amazing, and it shows how important these principles are today. As technology changes everything, as power shifts, these basic legal ideas are going to keep being tested and reinterpreted.
It makes you wonder what's next for these legal concepts, especially as the world gets more complex.
That's the interesting thing about law. It's always changing to keep up with society. What might be a clear case today could be seen differently tomorrow. As new technology comes up, new ethical questions, and new ways that power is used.
So how do we, as individuals, how do we keep up with all these changes?
The key is to stay informed, talk about these issues, and make sure our leaders are creating a fair and just legal system.
Well said. And remember, everyone, knowledge is power. The more we understand these legal concepts, the better we can navigate this complex world, and the better we can speak up for a just and fair society.
I totally agree. It's been a pleasure talking about these ideas with you.
And with you, listeners, we hope this deep dive has made you curious and given you the tools to think critically about the world. And that's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.